first true test of the Fantasticar and Vintage happened this weekend at the Oklahoma Land Run, and it won the tournament. Welcome back, Vintage Gamers, to another tournament report. This time we're talking about the 2026 Oklahoma Land Run, one of my favorite tournaments every year, bigger and better this time, and let's talk about what happened. So, as per the usual tournament report, I'm going to do a bunch of different sections, and I'll provide links and break it up by sections so that you can jump to whatever is going to interest you. First, we'll talk about the tournament itself, how I felt about how the tournament was run, what was going on at the tournament, that kind of thing. Then I will talk about the metagame from the tournament. I have all the data from the land run already into a sheet, so we can check out how well did certain decks do, what decks were played, etc., etc. And then I will go over my vintage main event, and I will talk through all the rounds. I have notes from every round, and we can talk about my performance during the event. So, the Oklahoma Land Run this year was at the Reed Convention Center, which is an upgrade. Last year and the years prior that I had been there, we were playing out of the Game HQ store, which was a very good event, to be fair. But upgrading to a convention center gives more space for more players, and I think a little bit of a prestige boost towards drawing in more people for future events. And they drew in a huge crowd for this event. This was a 58 team trio event, an 180 person legacy event, and an 125 player vintage event. An extremely great weekend. So shout out to Red Dirt Gaming and the people behind the Land Run for running an amazing event. For me, I was really excited to play in all of these events just because, well, it's always a great time. And even though the formats are in not the best shape, I did get the sense that everyone was really happy with how the event was handled, with how the rounds were run, where the event was in comparison to last year, and those kind of things. So I was unfortunately unable to make the Team Trios event due to travel complications. We were supposed to fly out of Rhode Island on Thursday night, but there was a huge storm over DC, which ended up meaning our plane was delayed by multiple hours, meaning we could not get our connecting flight through Chicago, and we were going to be unable to make the Trios event. My team for Trios was going to be me on Vintage, Tony Scapone on Modern, and Dan Nelson on Legacy. I was really excited to play in the Trios. I love Trios. Trios is a fun tournament, especially because I'm very lucky to have teammates who let me play the Vintage seat. But we were unable to make Trios. So I didn't get to play in that event, but I did still get into play. I still got to play in the Legacy Open for a Mox Sapphire and the Vintage Open for a Mox Emerald. I'll just quickly go over that Legacy Open. I played shops. I played Forge. Let me pull that list up here. I'm not going to talk about Legacy too much for this event. I did play this Fantasticar Tron list here, which was created by Matt, DFA. I think this deck is solid. I played it in a league. The league went up on my YouTube channel, and it does seem like it does a very powerful thing. However, when you don't get your 3-ball and your Chatless or flip a Fantasticar, your deck can really flounder. And I ended up with a 1-2 drop in this tournament. Didn't want to play any more Legacy after I had already been knocked out of top 8 contention because I didn't feel like this is going to be the same Legacy format that will be played at Eternal Weekend. So it didn't really seem like I was getting any great value if I wasn't having a lot of fun. So for the Legacy event, it was just a 1-2 drop. I don't have any notes from it. But for the Vintage event, we played out the whole thing and played out 4 extra rounds on Saturday because I decided to drop from the Legacy event. So let me show you my deck choice for Vintage. For Vintage, it should come as no surprise based on things I've been saying on Twitter and in the Discord. I believe that Raker Shops is the best deck in the format to a broken degree. It is on a power level that is much higher, in my opinion, than the other decks of the format. That does not mean I think you can't beat this deck. It's a very beatable deck, but you can very much see that it is warping the entirety of Vintage around it and forcing everyone into a how do we beat Car metagame. And the ways you beat Car are by playing Force of Wills and going at a similar speed. So that would be something like Jewel or Doomsday. Or you can make your control decks battle with Car on an even playing field by doing things like 8 forces, 2 mind break traps, main deck consigns, main deck null rods, extra cards like that in the sideboard. One of my matches was I had a fantastic 3-game set versus an Esper Frog player, and he was showing me the cards he had to play to get to that point where we were playing a fun and close match, and it is a lot. You need to do a lot of things, sacrifice a lot of other matchups in order to make your blue deck playable against this. So this wasn't the deck I was 100% locked in on right away. I started my testing and I was like, okay, yeah, this is broken. I was the first player to 5-0 a league. I went 5-0 10-0. I 5-0'd multiple leagues after that with this deck, but then, adjustments started happening. People started, going to those extreme measures to counter the deck. And then I was feeling a little bit down on the deck. I wasn't super happy. I was like, well, this is definitely broken, but I'm not even beating these decks as much as I was before. And the secondary part of that is the mirror is awful. The mirror is awful, and the mono-white matchup are awful in terms of play patterns, player agency, those kind of metrics. I am someone who loves to play a nice blue mirror in Vintage where I can leverage my format knowledge and the amount of matches I've played with decks to gain an advantage. And I wasn't feeling that playing this deck a lot was giving me a substantial advantage over other Raker players, and I assumed there would be many, many Raker players in this event. So I was pretty down on the deck. So then I was looking at ways to beat the deck, including, like I said, Jewel and Doomsday, and I played a bunch of Doomsday, but I was getting a little upset with the Doomsday deck because the Doomsday deck is not very good against the decks that are trying to beat Raker. The Doomsday deck still doesn't want to see these main deck consigns, these main deck mind break traps. It doesn't like the cards that are being used to beat Raker. And so I didn't feel that I wanted to take Doomsday to the tournament, that I still felt like people were going to show up with Frog, because people always show up with Frog no matter what. And so I wasn't happy with Doomsday. So then I went back to Raker, retooled my list to be a little bit closer to what I actually started with at the very beginning of the testing of this deck. And in the end, I had a bunch of very successful testing leagues. A lot of these leagues are going to show up on this YouTube channel in the coming days. I have a bunch of pre-recorded videos that are going to go up over the next week and a half. I will probably take a small break during that week and a half to detox myself from the Vintage Car meta, but I will. I'm still planning on putting up videos every Monday, Wednesday, Friday up until the August announcement, anyways. So, but maybe a couple less streams here and there. We'll see. Either way, I went back to this list, and what you're looking at is the list I played in the main event. However, the main event was not the only event I played in. I also played in a win-a-buy trial on Legacy on the day that I dropped from Legacy. So I played 4 rounds. I didn't take notes from those 4 rounds, but I played 4 rounds with almost this exact list, except I had 4 mind break traps, no null rods, and I had 1 less defense grid and the Tormod script. So those are the only differences. And after I went 4-0 in that side event, I was looking around at the side event and what people were playing, and I saw a lot more Jewel than I was initially expecting, and I saw some more blue decks than I was initially expecting. And so that's why I ended up going with the 2-2 Null Rod Mind Break Trap split here. And 1 more defense grid instead of the Tormod script. Now, I really like the Tormod script. I feel like it shores up like your options on your Tezzeret toolbox. However, I don't know that it's like super necessary, especially if you think there's gonna be an extremely low number of exactly dredge, right? So I decided that was like the weakest card in the sideboard, and that way I could get another defense grid in for when I played against all of these possible blue frog matchups. So this list on a whole should be exactly what you would expect from me based on my postings online. You have your misstep to help you counter ancestrals, consigns, and break your mirror on the draw. Hopefully, like you can hit a 1 mana card on the draw and stop your opponent from doing something really powerful. And then the needle in the main has proven to be fantastic in basically almost all matchups. It always has a target. It's another card that's really good for like locking up a mirror match on the draw, or locking up a mirror match on the play, or finding a way back on the mirror match on a draw. If your opponent like leads with a ring and you go and tutor and you can, turn off their ring, their hand might be weak and based around ring, those kind of things. Obviously, anything you needle in the mirror is going to stop you, but you have the agency on what you choose to name with your needle. So you can pick the card that is the most effective against your opponent and the least effective against you, that kind of thing. And so I was really happy with the needle in the main, so I ended up keeping it. And then the other flex slots of the deck ended up being, I put 2 Talon Gates back in the main of here, mostly because there was a bunch more Luris Deathrite Shaman happening, and also I wanted to have like some chances against mono white when you lose the die roll and get void mirrored. That was my big reason for having Talon Gates. Now I didn't want to go crazy about mono white. I didn't think there'd be enough mono white players at the event to justify playing like Castle Dooms or more gates in the sideboard or anything like that. So I did only go with the 2 Talon Gates in the main. But if you are like really concerned about mono white, like you're trying to play online, you can do things like put Castle Dooms in your deck, put more of these cards in your sideboard, and bring them in for those matchups. And it's probably worthwhile considering how much initiative is being played online compared to in paper. So in the sideboard, like I said, I put up a 3rd defense card because I was just super worried about playing against some like a super overwhelming number of blue decks that had like I said, those 10 different main deck cards already pre-boarded for you. Because Raker entered this tournament with a target on its back. Everyone knows Raker is the best deck in Vintage. Everyone knows they have to build their decks to beat Raker. So this tournament is, everyone's coming in knowing they have to beat Raker. What are they going to bring? Well, tons of Raker hate. So this felt like the best way for me to fight back against that. 2 Dismember is mostly for Collector Oof and Mono White, but I'm not even sure these are like super effective. You can kind of bring these in the mirror when you're like on the draw to try to hit a Flesh Raker and buy yourself a turn, but they're not the most effective cards. I could see these maybe being something else in the long run. We'll have to see. I ended up going with 3 Argenta Masticore instead of 4. I've tried playing a Lodestone Golem instead of the 4th Masticore. It's just really hard to cast multiple Masticore. It's a 5-drop. You're getting null rotted. It's asking a lot. And so while I always want to have a Masticore, it's not so hard. It's not so easy to have like a second Masticore get cast in the same game. So I went with 3 Masticore here, but I wasn't like super impressed with my Lodestone Golem along the way. So that one I'm not super thrilled about either. And then we have the Null Rod Mindbreak Trap split. Like I said, I played 4 Mindbreak Traps in the side event because I felt like the Mindbreak Traps were better than the Null Rods. They were good more often in the mirror than Null Rod was. However, I don't think the Mindbreak Traps are as good against Jewel, which is one of your, I don't think the Mindbreak Traps are as good against Jewel, which is one of your bad matchups that I kind of expected to play against a lot. Compared to Null Rod, where I think Null Rod is incredible versus Jewel, and I really wanted to have Null Rod so that I had some good play against Jewel. And so that's why we chose to do Null Rods over 4 Mindbreak Traps. But, as long as you have like all of these slots dedicated to that kind of matchup, it's something that makes a lot of sense for me. So that's why we were on Raker and what we chose to play in Raker. Let's see how that fared when we go and look at the metagame. And here is your Oklahoma Land Run metagame. And far and away, the most played deck in this tournament was 27 players, making up 21.6% of the metagame on Raker Shops. Let's scroll down here let's flip over to the graphs here. You can see far and away the most played deck in this tournament is Raker Shops. Even when you combine Esper and Luris Frog, it's only 12. It's only the 2nd most played deck. So Raker Shops more than doubling the play rate of any other deck. And we went into this tournament, everyone expected Raker Shops to be the #1 deck of this tournament. It's got the target on its back. How did it do against a field that's super hostile to it? It crushed. It crushed the field. It had a 54% win rate as the most played deck in the field. And if you do an estimation here based on the number of players, the estimated win rate of this deck in non-mirror matches, it was 55.2% on the weekend. So the deck that everyone thought was going to be the best deck, the overwhelming favorite for the deck that everyone knew they had to beat, still ended up with a 55.2% non-mirror win rate for the event. And Not only did it have an incredible overall statistical output, it also put 2 players into the top 8, including the winner of the tournament. So, with all thoughts directed towards Raker Shops, all the hate directed towards Raker Shops, it was still the, in my opinion, best performing deck based on this data. Now, there are obviously decks as we go down here that will have higher win rates than Raker, but they don't come anywhere close to the play rate, the number of players on the deck. So if you were wondering if Oklahoma Land Run would be supportive of the idea that Raker Shops and the Fantasticar are a deck that is too powerful and might deserve a restriction coming on August, I would definitely say that the data here supports that theory. Let's carry on and talk about the other decks in this tournament, what got played as an answer to Raker Shops, and what actually worked. The second most played deck was actually Frog with a 7 and 5, and when you combine them, actually a quite good performance from the Blue, Black, and Esper Frogs. So you had a 53% win rate from Blue Black and 64.5% win rate from the small Esper contingent. I think backed by some very strong players with some solid ideas on how to approach the matchup. We'll talk about the Esper one a little bit more when I talk about my round 2 matchup, which I thought was quite interesting. But I think those decks, knowing what you're going to see, because I think this metagame was pretty predictable. You're going to see a huge percentage of Raker, and then some of the decks that beat Raker. I think knowing that we're going to have, maybe half as many viable decks as we did pre-car, which is kind of the data that I'm looking at right now. I'm looking at the metagame has shrunk by maybe 50% in terms of like viable archetypes. Knowing what the majority of players are going to play is very good for the tempo/control blue player. They get to do, they're not going to be as harmed by the off-meta choices or their bad matchups. Like, so if they are gearing everything to beat Raker and the decks that beat Raker, then they actually get a huge upside from that. And we talked about this a little bit in my Patreon and YouTube membership video pre-Land Run, but the way I look at the format before Car was that there was a huge A tier of 10 to 12 different viable decks that were all within a few percentage points in terms of win rate, and they were all like more than 6% or at least 6% of the meta share. Now we have 3 distinct small groups of decks. We have, Raker on its own as the S tier deck that's encompassing a huge meta share. Then you have a similar sized meta share of decks designed to beat Raker in terms of like style, which is typically like Jewel Shops and Doomsday. So 2 decks there. And then you have a group of decks that are designed to beat the decks that beat Raker. So the anti-Raker decks, which is something like Gift's Drain Breach is very good against Jewel and Doomsday. And to some extent, like things like you have some decks that float in between those 2 groups, something like Luris Deathray Shaman, which is like an anti-Raker deck, but actually it does succeed against the anti-Raker decks. Or sorry, yeah, so something like that. And then you have some in-betweens there, and that's not all like a very locked in stone groupings, but the groupings there are small. When you combine all those decks that I just said, that's maybe 6 or so different viable decks for the most part. And that is like half as large as the field as we were before. And when we start getting down to it, these decks that were played here, even if we go to Jewel Shops, which was the second most non-Frog deck played, that's 8% of the metagame. When you get to Initiative on 7 copies, it's less than 6% of the metagame. So like the decks that would have fallen under that A category, 6% of the metagame previous to Car, are only there's only 5 of them instead of 12. So these are things I was thinking about as we went into this event. But like I said, the Frog decks did really well, which is I think a good sign for the next month or so before restrictions may happen, that we can maybe get to some sort of balance and parity, and also maybe like at least some more deck selection options. The metagame will be warped around the presence of this Raker Shops deck. But the fact that you have an overwhelming and maybe unhealthy metagame shares doesn't mean you can't have a balanced format. And that's why you don't do bans of restrictions on only balance. You look at metagame shares, you look at balance, you look at play patterns, you look at community, you look at all of these other factors, because I think we're going to end up in a spot. Vintage is really, you have a huge range of cards to choose from. We're going to end up in a spot where we do see somewhat of a balanced format, but will it be a fun format and will it have a healthy meta shares? I think it's fairly unlikely. So let's just keep going down through this list and talk about some of the other decks. Jewel came in here as a deck that I think was a good counter to exactly Raker. I don't think that the Jewel deck is great against some of the other decks people will play into this metagame. However, I do think it's good into Raker specifically. I think it's one of the few decks that has a very solid winning rate against Raker. So we saw 10 Jewel players, like we said before, 8% of the metagame, put up a decent showing, 51.6%. From what I can tell, Jewel actually did do very well against Raker, but it didn't really do well against the rest of the field. For some reason, 9 players showed up with Oath. Oath is not a deck I thought would be a great choice into this field. And because I don't think the Oath deck is particularly great against the Raker Shops decks, you kind of lack the amount of counter magic you need to live. The Oath plan is very slow, and sometimes you can even get card through an Atraxa. And then compound that with the fact that the anti-Raker decks, the decks that are actually good against Raker, Doomsday and Jewel, eat Oath for breakfast, you end up with a very hostile field. And it really showed in this data here with only like a 40-ish% win rate. Doomsday, another one of the anti-Raker decks, did not do as well as Jewel did. I do think the Doomsday deck still did do well against Raker, but there's still a number of people here playing Frog decks, especially other Lurrus decks. So between Lurrus Control, Esper and Blue-Black Lurrus Control, Lurrus Breach, Lurrus PO, I just don't think there was enough good matchups for Doomsday, and this was part of the reason I really didn't want to bring Doomsday to this event. It was, this deck is going to be good against that 20% of the field that's Raker Shops, but is it good against the other 80% of the field? I kind of think it wasn't, and the data here does somewhat back that up, though it wasn't a bad performance by any means, 49% win rate. The deck that had a stellar performance at a lower play rate here was the 8 copies of the Lurrus Deathrite Shaman deck, the bug deck with Lurrus. It's an interesting one for me because my testing didn't really indicate that the Lurrus Deathrite Shaman deck was actually good against Raker. There's a lot of data out there, but so far on Magic Online and challenges, it hasn't looked amazing against Raker. And then my personal data was I was overwhelmingly winning Lurrus Deathrite Shaman versus Raker matchups. But I did also see some Lurrus Deathrite Shamans posting their personal data that had them winning the Lurrus Deathrite Shaman versus Raker data. So, you always have to normalize personal data with the user who is playing the deck, right? So I am always going to make a deck look a little bit better than it actually is because I have a whole amount of prior knowledge, format knowledge, repetitions that other players might not have. And so I always have to scale down your own, scale down your own data to kind of normalize it. However, I do a lot of that scaling in my own mental notations when I'm feeling out a matchup and trying to get a personal vibe on the matchup. And my vibe was that if the Raker deck wasn't having a winning record versus Lurrus Deathrite Shaman, it was super close. So that's why I don't really consider the Lurrus Deathrite Shaman deck to be an anti-Raker deck. I haven't really felt that it is that strong against Raker. And even in the top 8 of this event, the Raker player that went on to win the event beat both the Lurrus Deathrite Shaman players on the way to the championship win. So that's my current feeling. However, based on what I can see in the data, and we have some head-to-head, I don't have the exact head-to-head. My script doesn't pull that, but I did look at the head-to-head that I saw on one of the other websites that does pull it. Unfortunately, their classification system is awful. It kind of groups all the workshop decks together. So I think we got some bad data from that because I do believe that the Jewel deck is much worse against the Lurrus Deathrite Shaman deck than the Raker deck actually is. So, yeah. But either way, we can tell that Lurrus Deathrite Shaman did have a good performance here, but we're starting to get to the point where you have, this is 8 players. So you're starting to get to some small meta percentages, 6.4. you're starting to get influenced a lot by who are the players registering this deck. The two players, the Lurrus Death Shaman players in the top 8 are, very experienced wizards who do well and would probably do well with other decks. And that's actually something we're seeing, with the online data right now as well. We don't have a lot of online data from the Raker metagame. All 3 weekends, the Sunday challenge didn't fire, and all the other challenges are firing with very low player counts. So you need to, when you need to realize that we're going to have a lot of noise in early data because we just don't have enough data. And even when we do have like full challenges with full player bases, we're still the smallest, and we still have, it takes us a very long time to build out data to a spot where we can be accurate with our predictions on how good a deck actually is. So I don't want to, go too deep into this point, but I am still pretty unconvinced by the Lurrus Death Shaman deck, even though, you could argue that this Lurrus Death Shaman deck had the breakout performance of the tournament, right? It is the highest win rate among the most played decks. It put up 2 decks into the top 8. It put up, two very winning decks into the top 8. However, it was only played by 8 people. I personally consider this Raker number to be more impressive. No one's going out here to beat Lurrus Death Shaman. Lurrus Death Shaman is just an answer to this this Raker percentage here. And definitely kudos to those players who chose to play that deck, but that's how I currently feel. So that's probably the secondary story of this tournament is the performance of Lurrus Death Shaman as a metagame call, because I wasn't convinced that pre this tournament that Lurrus Death Shaman would be a good anti-tournament metagame call, and it was. So Initiative, 7 copies of Initiative, less than 6% metagame share, but a good performance, 53% win rate, very, very reasonable. I think the Initiative players have seemed to realize exactly how they are supposed to play into Raker shops, especially when they win the die roll, they're super favored. One of my biggest problems with the Raker shops deck is the fact that it's really weak to Void Mirror, and if your Initiative player is on the play and mulligans a hard to Void Mirror, it can be very challenging to be able to put together any kind of counter play. So Initiative did fairly reasonably at this tournament as well. And then Lurrus Breach, one of those anti-Raker decks, also had a nice performance here, 55% win rate, 1 copy in the top 8. And like I said, before this tournament, I like this as an anti call. It's very good against these Jewel, Oath, Doomsday. I would assume Lurrus Death Shaman, but I'm not actually sure how that matchup plays out. I would have to go maybe dig a little bit deeper on Lurrus Death Shaman versus Lurrus Breach. But my assumption is Lurrus Breach is a nice anti-metagame call for this, and that seemed to show here as one of the anti-decks. So, Lurrus PO also actually had a very similar performance to Lurrus Breach. That one, I don't know why that's the case. If I felt like I liked the Lurrus PO deck here into this metagame, I would have maybe chose to play it. But, maybe it just has the right controlling tools to face up here. I'll have to go check out some of these Lurrus PO lists and see if there's anything interesting in terms of like sideboards that, are there null Rons in the sideboard? We'll take a look maybe at Violet's list or Charlotte Legacy League's list. There were no Lurrus PO players in the top 8, but there were 2 players here at 6 and 2, so very strong performances. So that's really, like I said, these are kind of, I think these are good signs for the upcoming month that we're going to be stuck playing this format, where we're going to need to try to make the most of it, still have fun playing Vintage. And if we can find these other choices that are viable, then it's, it's good for the health of the format for the month that we do have to engage with this. Dredge, there were still some players who showed up on Dredge as we expected from the land run event, and they didn't do very well. Same as the Oath players. This is just going to be too tough for Dredge. I was pretty low on Dredge pre-car, but there were still weekends where it made sense to play Dredge. I would just not play Dredge right now. The Dredge versus Raker matchup is the single worst one-sided matchup I've ever seen in Vintage data. It is convincingly 95% confident to be somewhere between a 70% win rate for the Raker player or up to a 95% win rate. It's somewhere in that range, which is absurd. You just never see things like that, and it's really bad out there. Dredge players, maybe put that down for a little while and try to find something else, or take a little break. It's always fine to take a little break if you're not having fun and it's not going to work out. So And then you go down into like some of these lower percentages. There's Sphere Shops didn't actually do super well. There were some other shops variants we'll take a look at as well. One of the cooler ones was the top 8. There was a blue Raker, not Raker deck, but a blue car deck. So let's go check out these inputs here. Right here, we have the top 8. We have 2 Raker shops, 2 Lurrus Deathrite Shaman, 1 blue-black Lurrus, 1 Tinker deck that had some POs and some Flame of Honors, and then 1 Gift Strain Breach, and 1 blue Fantasticar deck from Jujubee. So lots of cool decks. And then just right outside, we had, let's take a look at the 6-2s I think are worth taking a look at here. Initiative, Raker, Lurrus PO, Doomsday, Lurrus PO, Initiative, a Desperate Control player, and another Raker player, and another Lurrus Deathrite Shaman player. So, just outside of the top 8, I think I always like to look at these X2s because a lot of the times X2 will be the record that breakers out of the top 8. I know that this top 8 was actually a clean cut, so there is some difference there. But 6-2 is a really powerful performance, so I like looking at those lists as well. We can go hop over into Melee, and I'll just show you that blue Fantasticar list real quickly because I think it's an interesting point. It's something that maybe can shake things up a bit coming out of this event, and then we'll go over our round-to-round matches here. So if I just go quickly over into this land run here, and we go to our final standings here, and let's just take a quick look at Julian's mono blue deck here. So this is a other shops deck. This is a workshop combo deck based around the Fantasticar, but it's like a Jewel deck that doesn't play Jewel almost. So you can see here, it's a risky deck in my opinion because some of these numbers don't look ideal to me, and we'll go over why. So you see here, it's got a very a light mana base. It actually has the same number of lands as Raker shops. You have 4 Tomb, 4 Workshop, 1 City, 1 Talon, 1 Academy. Does it have a Saga? Actually, it might not have a Saga. Interesting. But it has the 4 Sink into Stupor as the blue split card of land and blue spell. And then heavier on the Mox Opals, 2 Mox Opals, a little bit lighter on the keys. And then obviously it takes away the big Tezzerets and Tezzeret package. And instead of playing those cards, it plays blue cards. So Time Walk, Tinker, Ancestral, 1 main deck Hercules, 4 Force, 4 PO, 4 Stock Up. So the big, powerful, big blue cards. And then, no Tezzeret, right? But we're still playing 4 Monolith, 4 Car, and 4 Ring. So you still have a lot of the same, powerful core. But what are we looking at here for blue sources? We have a Talon Gates as a half a blue source, so that 1.5, 5.5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's a really low blue source count. And when I saw Jujubee playing some practice games, saw a bunch of blue cards get stuck in his hand. However, I think that's not the worst thing. I might be tunnel visioning too much on that because what you do have here is really powerful options. So you have the ability to do those powerful PO and stock up lines when you do have the blue mana. And when you don't have the blue mana, you can obviously pitch them to Force to protect your Car and Ring. I tried a lot of lists like this one in testing because I felt, okay, well, I have this broken Raker Shops deck. The only way you supplant a deck like this is typically play a similar deck with forces. That's how you usually beat and win a combo mirror. Historically, I think about when players used to play Storm in Vintage, it had a really hard time beating PO, which was a similar deck because it was not playing Force. So the idea of building a Fantasticar deck with forces is very appealing. But in my testing, I never really got the numbers right. A big problem here is I looked at my last build that had a similar setup to this, and I had 4 Tezzerets in it. And that was probably a huge issue. This blue count is actually not bad. It's the blue land count that's a little suspect to me. The blue count here is 4, 8, 12, 14, 18, 21, which is pretty good. It's not 23, 24, which is what the normal blue decks play in Vintage. But in terms of Jewel, this is 1 more blue card than a lot of Jewel lists have. So I think your force count is quite high. However, I'm a little worried about your blue count if you're trying to cast cards like Stock Up and Pio. That's just my concern. And like I said, I could be way off. I'll probably play this deck through a challenge or a league to get a better feel for it, and we'll see if it makes a big change in the metagame moving forward. Okay, so that is the interesting deck list that I thought I wanted to talk about before we get into my tournament. Let's go over to my tournament. We have my deck list here, and we have my results down here. I'm going to go round through these matches. We'll talk about my notes and what I remember from the matches. Any cool or interesting things that came up. It should be noted that a lot of these rounds were really fast because of the nature of my deck and how they go. But we have some cool things to talk about regardless. Let's go through my tournament report. Obviously, I started round 1 with a bye. I went 4-0 the day before in the side event and won a bye. It was a really cool side event tournament because in the end, there were 4 people with 3-0s and 2 byes can get awarded to the 4-0s. And the 4 people who were there was Florida Legacy Club, Jason, and then me, Dan, and Tony, the whole team that was going to play trios. Dan and I roomed with Tony for this event too. So our whole hotel room was in contention to get buys in this event. Tony ended up beating Dan, and I ended up beating Jason. So Tony and I took home buys for the next day. And so round 1, I get the buy. And round 2, I go up against Pyro. This was the Esper Lurch control. And this was probably my favorite match of the tournament. I think the most cool and interesting things happened in this match. It was a real pleasure to play this match. So here you're looking at their deck, which has a Snapcaster Mage in it, which is an interesting one, a Time Twister for the Bowmasters, and like I said, 4 Force, 3 Negation, 2 Mindbreak Trap, 2 Spell Pierce, 2 Consign, and 2 main deck Null Rods. So very heavily geared towards the matchup. And then even more in the sideboard. 2 Hurkyl's Recalls, 2 more Null Rods, and a Seal of Cleansing. So a really high amount of cards to make the matchup very attainable. And the matchup was very close. So we played a 3-game set. Game 1 was an Ancestral Recall on my upkeep. And then they forced my car on turn 1. And then I had played the car off of Workshop. My Workshop got wastelanded, and my opponent went Jet and also played a Frog on turn 2. This was like maybe a little bit of a mistake on my part, but I'm not actually sure. I held a Chalice in my hand on 0 that I could have played, but I wanted to hold it because I was going to follow up my next turn with a Raker, and I wanted to get the extra mana off of the extra mana trigger off of the Raker with my Chalice on 0, and I felt like the percentage chance that my opponent had drawn a Lotus Jet, Pearl, or Sapphire with the Ancestral, because they would have played it on turn 1 if they had already had it, was like on the lower side, and I think the upside of having the Raker spawn was higher, but it did end up being a huge punish because my opponent did draw the Jet off the Ancestral and was able to play the Frog. I mean, I guess technically they could hold the Jet on turn 1, but it seems very unlikely when you're up against a deck that has like a Vexing Bauble and a Chalice and 4 Tezzerets to go get it. So that's what I did. I ended up going to my next turn. I played a Raker. The Raker got to do, trigger a couple times, but when it went to my opponent's turn, the Raker got swords, and I got hit by a Frog. On the next turn, I cast a Ring, not really expecting it to resolve, but it did resolve. So I had a chance in this game. I drew some cards with the Ring, but my opponent put a Bowmaster in play, and that Bowmaster grew a little bit bigger. And then between the fact that there was a Bowmaster in play, and I was a little tight on mana after the Wasteland, and the Raker going away, I drew some cards with the One Ring on the last turn, but I wasn't really able to put together a winning line. Even like a car attack wasn't going to be enough there. So I ended up losing that game 1. But it was, an Ancestral game where my first spell got forced and then I got wastelanded and frogged on the same turn. So the fact that I even had like a chance in that game is pretty crazy. It's just, shows how powerful my deck is. But like definitely the blueprint of what the Esper Frog deck wants to do and how it can and does sometimes win those games, Ancestral, force the cards that matter, attack on the mana side, attack on the drawing side, get some hate pieces in, that kind of thing. Game 2 was really cool as well. Game 2, I had a Vexing Bauble start, which resolved, and then I played out all my cards, prioritizing my Tezzeret triggers, because what I wanted to do was be able to play a Tez Emblem so that I had a way to play through Null Rod. And so I on turn 1, I played out all my cards, and I like untapped the Monolith with Tezzeret, but I held on to my Tezzeret activation. It didn't go minus because I wanted to then ultimate my Tezzeret. And that's what I did. On the next turn, I ultimated my Tezzeret, got an emblem. But one of the weird parts about this game was I had a very low amount of actual attackers because all the cards I played on turn 1, 3 of them were monoliths or manifold. So those cards don't untap naturally. So even though I had those, I was like, I stand up my Mox. I had an Emerald that I stood up, and then I stood up my one ring after. Cause I got null rotted pretty much immediately, so I wasn't able to use my ring again or do anything like that. And so I stood up my Mox. I stood up my null rod. I stood up my ring. I didn't really want to stand up my Vexing Bauble because then if that gets swords, then my opponent gets to use forces again. But so I was standing those things up. And then towards right where as I'm getting ready to win, my opponent Hercules recalls me. And so that resets all my artifacts. And I actually don't have a lot of mana in that situation. And I'm pretty lucky my opponent's a little choked on mana as well because they had to DT for the Hercules recall. So they didn't get to like strip mine my workshop. Because they didn't get to strip mine my workshop, I'm able to replay some of my my cards out. And like this whole time, I'm choosing to like untap my artifacts that have counters on them to get extra counters. But you have to be kind of careful because you have to use the Tezzeret's untap and gain a +1/+1 counter before you actually get the Tezzeret to put the counters on when I go to combat. So it was actually a really weird and very constrained board state, and I almost aren't able to come back. I replay my things, but again, a lot of my artifacts there don't untap, so I can only really attack with them once. And so then I actually had a really cool choice where I had enough Tezzeret counters to emblem again. I didn't choose to emblem again. Instead, I chose to fetch another 0 out of my deck because my Vexing Bauble had been bounced to my hand. That way I'd have at least 2 attackers that didn't have any untapping issues. And so I just like kept playing attackers, kept building them up. My opponent bought back Luris, but it was just like one turn too short of them stabilizing. And so they almost stabilized through my emblem, which was I thought it was a really cool game because I felt really pressured, especially by the Hercules recall. The Hercules recall was really good in that specific scenario at resetting me. I haven't been like super happy with Hercules recall from the blue-black or controlling side because I didn't know if it would do enough in like certain scenarios. Like you're bouncing a ring, you're bouncing a bunch of Mox in, like it's not actually gonna do anything. But in this scenario with null rod in play, the clock being a little suspect, the Hercules recall was really good reset and made for a really compelling game. Game 3 was a pretty cool one as well. Opponent was kind of agonizing over the hand, didn't know if it was a keep or not. I ended up liking this keep. The keep was really cool. It was Wasteland Lotus, Null Rod, Snapcaster Mage. And so there's a threat in play, there's a Null Rod, there's a Wasteland. It obviously not the fastest clock, but getting a Null Rod down right away and being able to workshop, that's a pretty powerful sequence. Also, I know from talking after the game that the hand contained like a Consign to Memory and a Hercules recall that they weren't castable yet, but when they would be castable, they'd be very good. So I like the keep in general. But the way this game went was my opponent played these cards and I went Workshop Car. But I didn't have the 0/0 nut draw to just 16. I just played Workshop Car Go. My workshop got Wastelanded. So then I played an Urza Saga. I actually had a hand that had a pretty deep amount of lands in it. I had an Ancient Tomb and that kind of thing. So I played an Urza Saga. And my opponent got maybe a little greedy, a little aggressive. It made a lot of sense based on the context of the hand because they weren't super worried about constructs with the Hercules. But they had drawn the blue land for turn. And so they consigned my mana ability on Saga to prevent me from playing. I had like a Soul Ring in my hand, like a 1-drop to trigger an attack with Car. Maybe a little bit of like a tempo-oriented play. But because the mana was consigned and I had that Ancient Tomb in hand, on the next 2 turns I made constructs. And, with those constructs, I was able to pressure my opponent's life total. These constructs did eventually get Hercules, but by the time they got Hercules, I was able to, pick back my Car back up and then play and crack my Car. And so I did end up was able to like sneak through that game, even through a ton of hate cards just based on the way it played out. So yeah, like I said, this was probably my favorite. This will probably be the longest match we talk about, but it was definitely my favorite, most interesting match of the tournament here. So that was a round 1 win against Esper Control, kind of snuck by I was feeling pretty good about that. And then round 3 happens, and I am up against Will on mono white initiative. And like I said, I really dislike this matchup as the Raker player, especially when you lose the die roll. I'm going to say this a bunch of times during the next few rounds, but and I just want to preface it by saying I hate this statement. I hate talking about the die roll and going first. Like, these are normal things that happen in Magic, and you have to be able to play on both sides of play and draw. However, I think it's worth pointing out because of the nature of this Raker Shops deck. Being a non-blue deck, one of the greatest equalizers in Vintage in terms of play draw is by playing Force of Will, you can get yourself to turn 1. Not having that Raker as the Raker player means that if you are on the draw in the mirror, you are so far behind. You have you have to keep certain hands that can come back from being on the draw. And then against mono white, if they're a really seasoned mono white player, they might be mulliganing pretty hard towards Void Mirror, and then it ends up being a huge problem. Seeing this list, I'm actually really surprised. There's actually only 2 Void Mirrors in the main. There are 2 Dampening Spheres in the main and 2 more Dampening Spheres in the board instead. It's a very interesting choice, because I felt like Void Mirror is like the top tier card against Raker Shops, but I also understand why Dampening Sphere is very good against Dampening Sphere is good against Raker Shop, because Dampening Sphere is, every spell costs 1 more, so you can't go top combo, and then all the lands only tap for 1, so you're really hampering the mana situation. But Void Mirror is the card I'm actually the most afraid of. So in this mono white initiative match, I do lose the die roll, and my opponent kept a turn 1 7 card Void Mirror hand. I actually kept a hand that was pretty good against Void Mirror. I had a Saga, and then I had a Saga followed up with an Ancient Tomb. And I had the Saga followed up with Ancient Tomb, but unfortunately, just based on the strength of my opponent's hand, 2 Constructs was just too slow. However, it was actually a very winnable game up until the last draw. Because I had the ability to play Car, because I would have the ability to play Car after my Saga went off, because what I can do is I can get a Black Lotus, and then I can use it to make mana colored mana to play through a Void Mirror. I was actually saving a bunch of 0 mana cards in my hand that I couldn't play through Void Mirror, and my opponent had already taken damage from his Ancient Tombs. So we all the way up until the last turn of the game, I would actually be able to 16 and one-shot my opponent through a Void Mirror. However, the turn before my Urza Saga went off, a Clarion Conqueror was played, so then I couldn't make the colored mana. And even at that point, I can still win if I draw exactly Talon Gates, phase out the Clarion Conqueror, get the, have the Black Lotus, crack the Black Lotus, Car, 16 power. So I did lose this game, but I was actually really happy about this game because I kept a hand that put me in a decent spot to have outs to win. Game 2, my opponent mulliganed to 5, and I played a turn 1 Tezzeret, played a Vexing Bauble, and basically just overpowered them. There wasn't a whole lot to do. And then game 3 was Mulligan Simulator. So my opponent is mulliganing to try to find, Void Mirror, Dampening Sphere hands. I'm mulliganing to try to find hands that play through those kind of hands. And my opponent ended up mulliganing to 4 in this game. I ended up mulliganing to 5 in this game, and I kept a hand that I was really happy about on 5. Not really happy, but somewhat happy about on 5. That was Urza Saga, Mox, Mindbreak Trap, Raker. So this way, I have an Urza Saga that can go and get a Black Lotus to play spells through it, and then if those kind of things don't happen, I have the ability to start doing Saga Constructs. It's not a good hand by any means, but it's a hand that has game. Unfortunately, my opponent did not end up keeping on 4 a Void Mirror or Damping Sphere hand. My opponent ended up keeping a turn 1 Clarion Conqueror hand. So Ancient Tomb, Chrome Mox, exile a white card, Clarion Conqueror. So they're not expecting to play any more spells for the rest of the game for the most part. That Clarion Conqueror has to go with 7 attacks and win. But unfortunately, that hand was real good against my draw, where the trap doesn't hit the Conqueror, and then my 2 Moxes are off, and my Saga doesn't actually do anything unless I hit an Ancient Tomb. And I actually did hit an Ancient Tomb, but my mono white opponent's first 2 draws of the game were Wasteland, Strip Mine. And so I was unable to put together any threat to the Conqueror, and I did die and lost round 3. So a loss to mono white, and then I end up in a Raker Shops Mirror for round 4. I play a Raker Shops Mirror for round 4. I do lose the die roll. My opponent goes turn 1 Car Pass, and my hand was a One Ring. And so I'm like, oh, cool. I get to live for a whole turn. I'm drawing a card. The One Ring is the most pivotal card, in my opinion, in the entirety of the Raker Mirror. It is the card because Raker can't kill you through a ring. It almost will always buy you that. It will always buy you that extra turn. The problem is if your opponent carns you, you then can't do anything. And that's what happened here. My opponent found a Karn and I died. Game 2, I'm on the play. I went Tez Chalice, and my Chalice was just insane against my opponent and won that game. And then game 3, I'm on the draw. My opponent had a Tez on turn 1 and played, off of an Ancient Tomb and played a Forge. So like a really powerful start, but not, deterministically winning or anything. And my hand was able to play a car and crack a car through a Mindbreak Trap by having a Probe. And so I had to choose what to do with my 16 power. Do I attack and put my opponent to 1, turning off their Ancient Tomb? Or do I put 2 targets on a Tezzeret that's at 6, hit them for 8, and get rid of the Tezzeret so I don't Tezzeret doesn't find a Sensei's Top and I die? I chose to 16 my opponent and put them to 1. And it really constrained my opponent's mana on the Tomb. Like they have a key, a Tezzeret, a tapped Monolith, and a Forge. So like the things they need to hit here have to go kind of exactly right. And it can't even be like a work, they can't even draw using the ring right away. So they have to find like exactly a certain set of cards to power through there. And unfortunately, their top 2 cards after drawing were a Glaring Fleshraker and a Sensei's Top, and instantly killed me. So I die. I'm out of the tournament at 2-2 there. Played a mirror. I was pretty happy with the games I put together, and I actually think my hands were pretty good for being on the draw. Like one of them was a turn 1 ring, the other one was a turn 1 16 power and haste through Mindbreak Trap. So like I kept hands that were good for the mirror, but sometimes you're just not going to have enough. Round 5, another mirror, another die roll lost, and I play against Kelvin, an Eternal Weekend winner, one of the teammates from this event who was also on Raker Shops. So game 1 was I lose the die roll. My opponent plays a turn 1 Forge. I keep a hand based on a Karn, but I didn't hit the mana I needed to play the Karn on turn 1. So I just went for like a kind of a conservative Monolith pass line. And my opponent plays a ring, but not much else. And I get to play my Karn. And this is almost good enough most of the time, except for the fact that my opponent hits a car. And so if my opponent is able to just play a car and crack a car through a Karn, they're going to win. But Kelvin did not end up finding a 4th spell that he could cast to win with the car. And so the Karn is enough to buy me an extra turn where I take infinite turns and win. So that's an example of a game in the mirror where you were able to beat the opponent even though I was on the draw. So, these are the kind of things you need to be looking for when you're playing the mirror. You're looking for ring hands, you're looking for Karn hands. And unfortunately, these hands are good against different hands. So like as the Raker player on the play, you might have a hand that is turn 1 Chalice. You might have a hand off of Tez. You might have a hand that's turn 1 16 power and haste off of Car. You might have a hand that's just turn 1 ring. And all of those hands need different things for you to beat as the mirror. So like you are incentivized to keep things like turn 1 ring, but turn 1 ring off of like an Ancient Tomb might not even be good if your opponent has already hit you for 16. And like maybe your Karn hand single-handedly wins against an opponent's ring hand, but it's not very good against a Raker hand. And so it's really frustrating because you have to keep a hand that is only going to be good some amount of the time, even though it's a very, stylistically good hand. It's only going to be good against a certain set of draws from the Raker player. So we go on to game 2. I have a turn 1 Raker and I get my top trapped. I then have a ring on turn 2, which my opponent can't car me through the ring. Sorry, it's the other way around. My opponent has a turn 1 Raker where I top trap. I have a ring, or sorry, they have a ring on turn 2, which I can't car through the ring, and so then my opponent takes infinite turns and I lose. And then game 3 is I have a turn 1 Raker combo with Mindbreak Trap, and my opponent has a turn 1 Raker combo through Mindbreak Trap with the ring. But my opponent did not have a Mindbreak Trap, so my turn 1 Raker combo just won. Yeah, riveting Raker gameplay. So then I go on to round 6 up against Philip, who has a Jewel Shops list that has cars, I believe. Yeah, 3 cars in a Jewel Shops list. And so I probe my opponent, and I see a Force of Will, but no blue card and a run ring. So I slam a turn 1 Karn, and my opponent can't really do anything through it. However, they do have a car, and so if they can like play a car and have enough spells afterwards to break a car, I can still die. But I'm able to get a ring in before the car, and then I just play 2 Flesh Rakers and I break a car open and I win. And then game 2, I have a turn 1 ring. They have a turn 1 ring. I have a turn 1 ring, and then I needle the ring. They have a car that breaks open and kills my Tezzeret. But my car ends up being lethal. Oh, sorry. I have a turn 1 ring. They have a turn 1 ring. I have a turn 1 ring. I then needle the ring on my turn 1, maybe. At some point, I needle the ring. They have a car that's not broken open, so their car stands up and kills my Tezzeret, but then I play a car that breaks open and 16s them. So I win. Yay. I'm sorry. It's just, they're not the most interesting matches of Magic. So then I play off-camera feature match here versus Brandon. We're just playing, there's not as many matches. At this point, some matches are drawing. So we're just playing over on the off-camera feature match. We're playing another mirror. I lose the die roll. I keep a weak 6, or my opponent keeps Brandon keeps a weak 6 with an unflipped car. And then I had a 1 ring, but not really the mana to cast it right away. And so I miss on mana. So all I can do is play Workshop, Top, and Key to set up for an Academy on the second turn. My opponent plays a ring, so I no longer can win right away. But he doesn't win. He also doesn't win. So I go to my turn, then I ring, and I get a ring going. Unfortunately, when my opponent gets to their turn, Brandon finds a Karn and Karns me, and I lose. Game 2 was I play a turn 1 ring, and then I play a turn 2 top kill and just win. So straightforward. Game 3 was crazy. So game 3, my opponent has a turn 1 win with like a Raker flip card 23U. However, he chooses to play around Mindbreak Trap, which is totally reasonable. So he plays the car first and then plays the Raker last and still gets some triggers off the Raker. So I get hit for 17 on turn 1 because opponent chose to play around Trap. I have exactly Mana Crypt, City of Traders, the 1 ring. So I'm able to use the 1 ring. And then I have to win all my Crypt flips for the rest of the game. And so my opponent gets to play some cards, do some things or whatever, but goes back to me. And I win the Crypt flip and I go down to 1 life. And I have a new ring to not die to my own ring. However, I draw a bunch of cards. I go really deep in my deck, but I don't find any Tezzerets. I don't find any Sensei's Tops for my Raker. And so I can't win on that turn. All I can do is ring again, not activate it right away because I'm at 1, and I have to try to win the Crypt flip on the next turn. So I'm like, okay, well, I mean, I couldn't win, but if I had hit some Sensei's Tops, some of these things, then I could have won. So I pass the turn, and my opponent draws a bunch of cards again and finds a Karn and Karns me, and then I die. I do actually win the Crypt flip before I die, but I just can't do anything through the Karn, and I do lose. I do think I was kind of lucky there because after I blanked my opponent for a turn with the ring, Brandon could have actually done some more like tops and spinnings and stuff, but he was holding it all in his hand to make the triggers for later, which he didn't actually have to do because you can always get a top trigger no matter what. If he had done that, he would have been able to spawn and find a Mindbreak Trap and stop me anyways. So it was kind of cool that I was almost able to play through a game at 1 life after getting hit for 17 on turn 1. But it didn't end up working out, and I do end up dying there to end up at X and 3, 4 and 3 at that point, losing that. And then round 8, I play against my roommate for the event, Tony Scaponi, on Grixis Jewel Shops, or it's just the Transmute Jewel Shops. This matchup is really bad. I think that Tony is like very favored. Dan was able to beat Tony in this event, but obviously lost to Tony the night before. So these were not close games, but I was also a little checked out at this point. So game 1 against Tony, I kept a turn 1 ring hand. Tony had a turn 1 ring hand and killed me on turn 2. And in game 2, I kept a turn 1 car hand where I got Mindbreak Trapped. Sorry, I kept a turn 1 car hand with Mindbreak Trap, but my car got forced, and then I died through Mindbreak Trap. So, yeah, I end up 4-4 at this tournament. I mean, I'm not unhappy about my play for the most part. I think a lot of the things I chose to do in this event were really good. I definitely feel like my choice of Raker Shops was good. and I felt like I was doing the right things to win the mirrors on the draw. But the problem is, like, winning on the mirrors on the draw is just so hard. And so, it's really painful to just be played against the mirror 3 rounds and the mono white and only be able to be on the play in none of those games and none of those game ones. It's just really tough. It's going to be tough. So you have to, some things have to go right, and they didn't go right, and we ended up at 42nd place at 4-4, not helping the Raker win rate. But when you face 3 mirrors, you face 3 mirrors. So that's like kind of the overall sentiment of this tournament. It was really, the vibes were not good about the formats. The vibes around the event were fantastic. Everyone was having a great time. We thought that, the event was really well run. I highly recommend everyone go again next year. But the vibes surrounding Legacy and Vintage's formats for this tournament were not good. Everyone, who I talked to was like, oh man, I really love Vintage, so much fun. But right now, it's just not a lot of fun. And it kind of feels like, unfortunately, like the vibes of this tournament were sacrificed so that we could have the month of Raker shops before it does end up being restricted. And that's kind of, it's some of the things I talked about in my video before the event was how it's a shame that like Eternal Mania and the Oklahoma Land Run, these events are paper events that are happening once a year, are kind of going to have their vibes ruined so that we can make sure that there's Raker data that makes sense before restricting it. And so I kind of view this tournament as a sacrificial lamb to hopefully get fixed before Eternal Weekend. That's how I currently view it. It's unfortunate, but I do want to shout out all the people who came over and said hi during the event. I had lots of people come over and say they watched the event. They watched the format and the videos. Even some people who were playing Legacy and didn't play Vintage were like, oh yeah, sometimes I come and check out the videos, even though I don't even watch play the format. Super fun to watch the videos. So shout out to all the people I got to say hi to. Like I said, the vibes around the players and the event, fantastic. The event, well run, but the format is unfortunately just not in a great spot. Even if it ends up in a balanced spot, like I said, the play patterns are not ideal. You can tell from the way I took these notes that there's just not a lot of things to talk about. That's why I was super happy about the Esper round 2, where we had a back and forth 3-game set, interesting things happening. Because when it came to all those mirror matches, I have a lot of one-line notes. So, yeah, I think that's for the most part all I really wanted to say. This data is up and available if anyone wants to check it out. I'm sure Volrath will talk about it on Vintage 101. And I will continue doing the things I'm doing. I have, like I said, a bunch of videos recorded from and testing for this event. So I have a bunch of pre-recorded videos with Raker shops. So if you're interested in seeing why this deck is so good, I have a bunch of videos coming out for that. And then we will do the best we can to produce cool and interesting content until August 10th rolls around. And for those who are interested in my current view on the August 10th date and what we should expect, my expectation for August 10th is that the car will be banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage, regardless of what like the stats really look like. And I think the reason for that is people are really unhappy, and the play patterns are very obviously not good for what the players want to be doing in these formats. And I think it's very easy for WotC, who has said in interviews already that they weren't, expecting, when this card was created, it wasn't supposed to be like this for Eternal formats. I think it's very easy for them to say, okay, we made a mistake with this card for Eternal formats. Let's just get it out of the Eternal formats to the best of our ability and move on from there. That will obviously present some problems still for Vintage, because it will be a restricted card that will be in the format forever. And so a lot of decks will have the ability to randomly 16 power you on turn 1 forever. But I think the starting point to fixing this issue is to just restrict the car and then see where we land after that. If for some reason, Raker Shops ends up still being amazing after that, then you can look at other options like ring restrictions and monolith restrictions. In the very beginning of my adventure here with Raker Shops, I was like, oh wow, this is so broken that you might need to restrict Car and Monolith and Ring to even bring this deck down to the right power level. And I'm a little bit back. I've backed off that opinion recently because I don't think it's like so overwhelmingly powerful that you need to do all of that. However, it's really hard to predict how Car as a one of will fare in terms of like deck win rates. Especially when we start seeing the one car in Jewel, the one car in Raker, the one car in Sphere Shops, the one car in Doomsday, the one car in Tinker, one car in PO. All of these other decks are going to have one car. So I don't know if like Restrict Car does enough, but I think it should do enough to make Eternal Weekend a fun and competitive, very competitively diverse format. We'll have to see how it fares after August to see if that's actually the case. But that's my current recommendation, is just to have the car get restricted, and we'll see where we land after that. We want to try to push back towards the format we had before Car was printed. I think the format we had before Car was printed was one of the best Magic formats of all time. Wizards has said so in their articles. It is the ideal state of an Eternal format. I don't know if just restricting card gets us back to that, but we're gonna have to see as we move forward here. I think it's like really a stark difference seeing a format like this compared to what we previously had. If we previously had an unbalanced format, a top heavy, A beats B beats C format that happens in a lot of Magic formats, maybe it wouldn't be such a stark negative vibe around it. But because we were just doing so well as a format before Car, the vibes, unfortunately, right now in the places that people talk about Vintage, the Discord, in paper, at events, are just not great surrounding the format. So that's what's going on right now. Let me know if you have anything to add in the comments below. I did have a great time, even though I didn't perform super well at this event. Thank you to Ed and the Land Run guys for having me out there. And I fully expect to be back for more land runs in the future, and obviously more paper vintage in the future. More vintage content on this YouTube channel every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I'll see you then.